Hey there! Welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today it's one of the big ones, the newest album from Rosalia LUX. So I can freely admit that I've often felt a little out of step in my thoughts on Rosalia. I started off late to the party, and by the time the critical consensus really crystallized around 2022's Motomami, it just did not click for me as strongly as it did for seemingly everyone else. And some of that came from the odd balance that project was attempting between experimental reggaeton and her flightier theatrical impulses, which fit thematically but never quite had the melodies to fully stick, which often had me on the outside looking in. I appreciated it, I just didn't love it. But Lux looked to be a different beast entirely, drenched in classical iconography, collaborating with the London Symphony Orchestra, reportedly with lyrics in over a dozen different languages corresponding to female saints, as Rosalia was looking to explore both relationships, including the breakdown of her engagement to Raul Alejandro, and her faith, alongside a stacked list of producers from across modern pop music, from Pharrell to Ryan Tedder and El Guincho, although veteran collaborators Sir Dylan and Noah Goldstein were both back for the majority of songs here. In other words, it sounded like Rosalia could well be making her version of Magdalene by FKA Twigs from 2019. And even if it didn't fully work, the ambition was going to be worth exploring, even if I'm working off the digital version and I'm not considering the tracks tied to the physical release at this time, especially considering the lead-off song with both Bjork and Yves' Tumor that was absolutely awesome and now has me wishing for another Bjork album. And all of that is half true, but the more listens I gave to Lux, the more I like it and am simultaneously convinced that it's still a tangible step away from the truly big ideas that it was trying to explore. Probably the most I've liked her work since El Mal Carrer, but I'm not sure I can fully embrace it yet. And I want to largely start with the content because thematically, you would be excused if you didn't do your reading and all the saints and religious iconography that Rosalia is using. It's more using the poetry and the biblical scope to make the emotional journey feel seismic, and the blurry conflation of earthly passions and religious ecstasy, both that can be named as love and can feel similar at their extremes. Now, I've seen some describe this as melodrama, especially with the operatic strings and orchestration that only can work on pure emotionality, but I would push back on that. The stakes might be heightened, and Rosalia is leaping across her register with a very welcome intensity and breadth that spans hushed cooing to grand belting, but those stakes are dramatically sound when you translate the many languages sung for this album, a choice that was specifically done to amplify the grand global universality of the existential questions at this album's core. What is worth sacrificing for love, be it for another or a higher power? Songs like Porcelana and Reliquia and Sauvignon Blanc, they draw direct parallels to saints who gave up everything for an ascetic life devoted to God. Mundo Nuevo is a traditional interpolation that asks the question of giving up the world, but the follow-up question is just as deadly. Is the attention of your love really worth that cost? Is there a divinity within yourself, or is something taking advantage of you and your sacrifice? It makes a lot of sense that in the aftermath of heartbreak, Rosalia would blend in that moral ambiguity, like Dios Es Un Stalker turns the police's Every Breath You Take from the perspective of a jealous deity with a lurking bass line, or how the album's centerpiece Berghain feels implacable in the face of divine intervention, where Bjork's trembling delivery is so effective in selling that grand scale, only for Yves' Tumor to increasingly shout, "I'll fuck you till you love me," a Mike Tyson quote that shows the other side of that consumptive love, be it divine or otherwise. And the album initially felt very Old Testament in that portrayal of what God and man demand of those who love them, reflecting back all manner of projection on Rosalia along the way, where she can weather some of that with scathing power, hold in her own space, but she's also trying to embrace forgiveness, or acknowledge some of her own culpability in all of it. And I really like how Memoria directly interrogates how some memories can be truer than others, which requires real vulnerability to untangle when it all feels so true. at least to yourself. I just wish more of the scattered ideas came together. It's not like Rosalia hasn't dabbled with that flighty ambiguity between the human and divine before. It underscored a lot of Motomami, even if this kind of flips the script towards a more delicate, aspirational femininity compared to the braggadocious confrontation in that brand of femininity. But with the final song Magnolias using on death and remembrance, where there's a simple hope that artistic beauty and passion could be elevated, I don't know, I'm not sure the gravitas fully lands given all of that playful ambiguity, especially when you also realize there's multiple songs here left over from the El Mal Querer sessions that wound up on this project and they don't quite feel as refined. I blame El Guincho for that. And that's the other side of this. I can respect the commitment to grandiose bombast, even the desire to be somewhat self-aware with it, momentarily take the piss out on Mio Cristo Piange Diamanti before diving back in, or how the gloriously elegant La Perla with Yahrtiza y su Esencia almost feels gleeful in how it rips a conceited ex to shreds. But not only can they feel a little questionable for tonal consistency, they also leave me wishing some of the greater experiments got the space to breathe within these symphonic arrangements that, especially in the back half, kind of start feeling abbreviated. And that feels odd, as this is easily some of her most refined production and especially sequencing. She can indeed deliver on this scale. Reliquia has this simply gorgeous and operatic strings and piano arrangement, but it all feels like it's building to the outro, where Venetian snares is stunning experimental percussion. I could have easily taken that for the entire song, and yet it sends up into this husky yet pulse-pounding Divinize that reminded me so much of FKA Twigs. Similar case for Dios Es Un Stalker and its supple patter effortlessly sliding into La Yugular and its utterly grand crescendo pushing the blend of human and divine to the zenith. Granted, the Patti Smith sample felt weirdly out of place thrown onto the end of that. The elongated squonks and pitch shifting with the Amapiano, timpani, and Dougie F samples of Porcelana didn't nearly land as well as I could hope. And doubling down on the final third on the softest possible ballads feels like the momentum just completely deflates. Even if Sauvignon Blanc and Memoria were really striking, especially the latter with the vocal contribution from Carminho. All this culminates on an album that's got the grand ambition to tackle huge ideas with gorgeous arrangements and genre-bending experimentation within a rock-solid cross-cultural framework with, again, immaculate sequencing, which had me more on board with Rosalia than pretty much ever before. But the more I tried to dig deeper into compositions and content, the more I was left thinking that an album that lays such a strong foundation with so many highlights should actually stick the landing, where the low points weren't so much bad as they expose gaps where Lux just doesn't fully follow through on what it sets up, or it swerves right before it can land. And yeah, that's a metatextual challenge that Rosalia has presented before. Love and God and indeed art, they give ambiguous answers by design. I'm fine with that. But like with certain moments of Motomami, this feels less like ambiguity and more like I'm not telling. A wink at the camera, assuming we're all in on the joke, where she'd rather have a punchline than a thesis. Again, that doesn't make it bad, just maybe a little shallower than it could be. But it doesn't exactly help the immersion of the project, and it ultimately might work better in pieces than as a whole. I get why the physical release is in 4 distinct movements, even if the digital release messed that up completely. And even then, I'm not sure any of those individual movements would fully coalesce either, given the songs there. Look, it's at least in the cusp of greatness. I want to recommend Lux on the grandest of moments, but I don't know. Might take a leap of faith to properly get to the light. We'll see. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you want to see more, please be sure to like, share, drop comments, subscribe. Look, I get the feeling this album is going to be kind of polarizing in that there's going to be a ton of critical acclaim beyond it, but those who press a little bit deeper might see some backlash. Again, that's what the comment section are there for. Have fun. But again, I do really want to stress how much I really like a lot of this. I just don't feel like it fully landed all the way that it could. Even if the ambiguity is part of the point, I feel like there's a difference between that sort of open-ended ending and then holding the audience at a distance. And when you start doing that, I start asking questions as to why. And I'm not always sure I get good answers with this project. But hey, comments down there below. Have fun. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If y'all want to get involved in helping support the channel, get albums on my schedule, or just yell at me on my Discord, link to my Patreon and YouTube memberships right over there. Don't feel obligated. Tough times out there. Get the feeling a recession's coming, so stay safe out there too. But hey, options available. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.